Hi. In this module, we are going to be talking about the time frame after Joan of Arc. So we're talking about Charles VII and the Dukes of Burgundy, and we're also going to talk a little bit about Brittany, being a region in France. Um, so as I mentioned, um, this is following Joan of Arc's death. And I should also just warn you that in this part of French history, there are some names that just seem to be repeated, and which can make things somewhat confusing because a lot of people seem to be using the same names. So you are going to hear about a lot of Charleses, Louis, um, and Henrys. So just be forewarned that these three names are very common and that we're referring to different Charleses, so you have to distinguish between the different Charleses and the different Henrys and the different Louis. And as you know, the name Louis went up to Louis XVI, so there were a lot of Louis. And we are now at Charles VII, so that should tell you something too. Okay, let's get started. So as I mentioned, it's post Joan of Arc. And following the coronation of Charles, so Charles VII, which was the Dauphin that Joan of Arc fought to get to the cathedral so that he could be crowned King of France and recognized in the traditional manner as the King of France. So following these victories, France begins to regain confidence, and we're now around 1450, and we're also done with the 100 Years' War. Actually, excuse me, we're not quite done with the 100 Years' War, but we're nearing the end of the 100 Years' War. Okay, so Charles VII and France regain confidence. So, Charles VII is crowned King of France. Joan of Arc is taken by the British and the Burgundians and is held under the charge of heresy. Following her imprisonment, Charles VII, now having been crowned king, no longer sees the use in Joan of Arc, really, and Charles VII was somewhat of a diplomat and did not feel like it would be safe to really try to get her back. So he sees no benefit in going after her and doesn't really protest her execution. So he wants to deal with matters in a more diplomatic way, and fighting for her would have just created an obstacle in his overall vision. So through diplomacy, ultimately, he regains the loyalty of Brittany and Burgundy to areas of France. So at the same time, the British are still trying to conquer France. So they're still holding on to some of northern France, but they cannot move into the southern territory. So instead of all-out war, they decide to go for a strategy of colonization. So the French are not going for this at all. So now the British are ruling over the French in northern France, and one thing that the French hate more than their own ruler would be a British ruler. And the British are also taxing the French. So the French are actually paying the British for the British to try to conquer more of France. So you can imagine how much that would enrage a French person. Okay, so the British are taxing the French in the northern area of France to pay for the war, and Charles VII is actually taxing the southern part of the country to pay for his share of the war. And at this point, war changes quite a bit. So war is no longer just fought by knights. There are a lot of infantrymen. Um, and the thing about knights is that once they have been knocked down from their horses, they're not that useful. So, because they become completely immobile due to the weight of their armor. So, at this point, they establish somewhat of a regular army, which has to be paid for, which is paid for by taxes. So, let's take a look at some changes in warfare. So, like I said, the army is paid for by taxes. The knights are not as useful. As you can see in this illustration, in the last module, I talked about the battle at Calais, which is a port in northern France, the shortest distance between France and England. And they had just a horrific battle there where the French lost basically their whole navy, and they had put knights on the ships, and which seems like somewhat of a ridiculous idea to us today. But they put knights on the ships, and once the knights fell off the ships, of course they drowned because their armor was so heavy, there was nothing they could do. So, like I said, decrease in usefulness of knights and increase in infantrymen, so men who are not on horses. There's also a great development at this point, and we're seeing changes in weaponry. So they're using artillery, and they're using cannons. And cannons make the difference here. So the benefits of the cannons is that it actually won them the 100-Year War. So thanks to that, the French won the 100 Years' War. And this whole use of armies and having a regularly paid army that just stays on also kind of increases confidence in the country's infrastructure, since throughout history, one of the problems that we see is when the infrastructure breaks down and they no longer have some type of military protection, as we saw in the Roman Gaul. Once the military protection breaks down, then people lose confidence, and there are many opportunities to plunder and pillage and do whatever you will. But once you have a more established military structure, people feel a little bit more at ease, and things can flourish from there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about also the changes in government. So we've talked about the changes in warfare. Let's talk about some changes in government that we see around the mid-15th century in France. So at this point, we see an increase in bureaucracy and use of professionals. I guess the two could go hand in hand. So Charles VII uses advisors and has professionals help him out. So instead of just having, let's say, the people around the court help you, you have people who are experts in a certain field, and they become advisors and, work in groups and teams and advise the king. So you also see a larger separation of the role of the monarch and the role of the government. So the government would be responsible for judicial, financial matters much more than, let's say, the monarch. So this kind of frees up the government to regulate itself instead of having the monarch decide on every single thing. So even though there is this relationship or this change in role between the monarch and the government, this does not mean that the monarch is no longer involved in governmental affairs. So the monarch still retains a great deal of influence and power on who gets appointed to what role. And this goes both for the government and also the church. So let's not forget about the involvement of the church, because it's still there, and we will be talking about that in the next module too. So what this does basically is it reestablishes the dynasty firmly as a working system with a larger bureaucratic network and a central army. So it inspires much more, let's say, confidence in the system. And as I said, Charles VII was more of a diplomat, and the way he would deal with dissidents would be to either offer land or favors. So this was one way to kind of have a diplomatic solution for those who were not happy. So instead of going into battle, perhaps give them a title or give them a plot of land to manage. So things are going, let's say, relatively well. I mean, it's still not great, but for Charles VII. But he does have one problem, and his one of the most annoying parts of his monarchy or his reign is the area of Burgundy. So, Burgundy is a thorn in Charles VII's side. So, there's this concept of appanage, and what an appanage is when land is given to someone, but under the condition that if you no longer have an heir for that land, then the land is returned to the kingdom. So Burgundy has been given an appanage a long time ago and is holding on to it, and they also would like to perhaps have their own kingdom. So why be part of France? Burgundy is a rich area. And at that point, it is ruled by Charles the Bold. So not Charles VII, Charles the Bold. He's the Duke of Burgundy. And he holds Burgundy and part of Flanders. And so those are the areas that you can see there in the pink. And these are very wealthy areas. Flanders, you might be familiar with, is a port town just with a lot of wealth in it. So these regions where the Burgundians were kind of collaborating with the British. If you remember, the British and the Burgundians were the ones who captured Joan of Arc. So the Burgundians have been kind of on the side of the British. They're not necessarily on the side of the French. So they're a little separate from the rest of France in that area. They were less affected by the 100 Years' War, since they were kind of on neither side, but maybe more on the British side, and a more independent region. And as such, they also had developed their own systems, their own court systems. They ruled themselves, and Charles the Bold saw no reason not to have somewhat of a independent kingdom. So Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, which we can see here in his portrait, would like to have his own kingdom, kind of resurrect the idea of what was done with Charlemagne's grandsons. If you remember, Charlemagne had 3 grandsons. Charlemagne, who had managed to have the most cohesive governmental system in France up to that point, had 3 grandsons, and the kingdom was divided between the 3, and it just turned into a big mess. The lines were not drawn according to cultural divisions. They were just separated into 3 parts, and each part was given to one grandson, and it did not succeed. So Charles the Bold kind of wants to resurrect the idea of that middle kingdom. If you remember, they were divided into east, west, and a middle part. And he kind of wants to revive the idea of that middle kingdom. So battles ensue. And in 1477, Charles the Bold dies in battle. And along with his death, his the dream dies as well. So the idea of a kingdom of Burgundy doesn't go any further than Charles the Bold's death. So the French declare Burgundy as French, and it takes several years to assimilate all of the areas of Burgundy under French rule. And this is what we call the Crazy Wars. So the Treaty of Arras declares Burgundy as French, and then the Crazy Wars is the battles that ensue, getting all those parts under French rule. Now, Burgundy is not the only area where an expansion could be seen. Of course, Burgundy was to begin with French, but the Burgundians did want their own kingdom and ultimately failed getting their own kingdom. Now, another area that we're going to look at here is Brittany. And so this is another area of expansion for France. But this, the way Brittany was acquired was more through marriage. So let's take a look at Brittany. So just a little bit about Brittany, first of all. So it's what I always picture as the nose of France. If you think of France as a face with a kind of a frowny smile or a frowny mouth at the bottom, the part that sticks out is what I think of as the nose. But anyways, Brittany is in northwest France, and it's a very lush area, and has many resources, and it also has a very independent spirit. So today, in current times, Brittany cherishes its traditional culture, and it does so much so that it actually has schools where you can learn in the traditional Breton language. So it actually has gone forth and tried to revive its language with some success, which is not an easy feat. So let's get back to the end of the 15th century. So Brittany, like I said, has a lot of resources, very nice land. I mean, you can see it's northwest France, very cultivable land. It's on the sea, close access to England, and it's under the control of the woman who holds the land is called Anne of Brittany. So whoever marries Anne of Brittany gets Brittany. So you can imagine that there was more than one suitor, and two main suitors were Maximilian of Austria, who was from the Habsburg dynasty, and of course Charles VIII. Now we've moved along in time, and we are now dealing with Charles VIII. So they're both vying for Anne's hand, and Charles VIII wins, and so now Brittany is under French rule. Unfortunately, Charles VIII dies in 1498, and he leaves Anne a widow. Now, Charles and Anne did not have any children, or no heirs. So Anne is a widow, and she has the ability to remarry. And if she remarries someone who's not from the French lineage, let's say she marries someone from Austria or someone from Spain or someone from England, then she takes along with her that territory. So this is a problem. So what solution is possible? The solution was a little strange, but in terms of French expansionism, it was pretty practical. So Charles had a cousin, and he steps in as the heir to the kingdom, and his cousin is Louis XII. So Louis XII just has one problem. He's married. So Louis, Charles's cousin, leaves his wife and marries Anne. And this way, the French maintain Brittany under French rule. And so finally, in 1532, Brittany officially becomes part of France. So this means the threat of it leaving with Anne is completely gone. It is now fully French. And it should be noted, we've talked about Burgundy, and we've talked about Brittany, and these different areas of France have very different personalities. Somebody from the south is quite different than somebody who comes from Brittany, let's say. And one of the ways in which this developed was just that France let the regions keep their local forms of government and traditions. So, although we had one national government, there was some flexibility as to the regional governance. So this is kind of the basis for what you see now, which is if you go to France, every region has their different traditions and their different ways of thinking about things. So it's much like in the United States, where there's a lot of differences between somebody, let's say, from Texas and somebody from Washington, D.C. So you can see the different traditions and the different cultures and how they evolved. But it should also be noted that although historically they've been allowed to maintain their traditions and their cultures and their ways of thinking, in French education, the concept of being French first is an important concept of being a good French citizen. So there. Okay, and I have some pictures of Brittany here for you. We kind of get a feel for their culture a little bit. So you see here a guy playing bagpipes, and you see the flag of Brittany behind him. They're waving some flags. And then you see some children with traditional Britain outfits during a parade. You see those little hats that women traditionally wear, and the aprons, and the dark blue gowns, if you will. And then you have a picture here of, on the bottom left, you have Mont Saint-Michel, which is a pretty neat place to go see if you get the chance. So it's by foot, it's only accessible at low tide. So it's kind of a cool thing to do, to walk over there at low tide. And then on the lower right, you just have kind of a cliff giving you an idea of the landscape of the area. So that's it for this presentation. In the next presentation, we are going to talk a little bit about the Renaissance and also the religious wars. Thank you.